So let's take a few minutes and go over and use and actually look at the actual tool that configures the logger and gives you the ability to set it up for what you want it to do. So I'm going to click on Tool, and it goes through a small test here and make sure that you have the right versions of VB.NET. And if you don't, you have to download them from Microsoft website. The tool does run on VB.NET. And here's the tool. And it automatically comes back to the last configuration that we had, which was a little test I was running called Oil Well. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clear it. I'm going to click on Clear All. Everything clears out. All the fields are cleared. Everything's cleared. Now, first thing I got to do is pick a brand. So I can pick Qlik, I can pick DirectLogic, I can pick DoMore, I can pick Modbus. I'm going to pick Qlik. As soon as I do that, a screenshot of the Qlik serial port settings in the Qlik PLC software pops up. And it'll become important here in just a minute, so hang tight and watch. Next thing it says, what model are you going to use? I'm going to pick the first one here. This is the model I'm using. And what that does is it tells the tool what memory locations and what features that Qlik unit has, so you can't ask for things that aren't there. If you're not aware of it, the logger is a master. The PLC or device you're talking to is a slave. The logger must request information and the slave will respond. And what we've done, we've built features into the tool so you can't ask for things that aren't available in that particular model. And that's why we're asking you for what the model is. Next thing is, what baud rate is it? And the default is 38.4, but I want you to watch something here. This is a screen capture of the Qlik software. So when I change this to 115.2, this changes to 115.2. We're telling you here, if you read the text, this is what your port setting should be set to. If you're going to tell the logger to communicate at 115.2, then you better have your PLC set to receive requests at 115.2. The ports have to be set the same. So make sure you do that. Make sure this is, whenever you pull this down and set this to, this screen tells you how it should be set in your Qlik PLC so they work, so they communicate. Next, folks, I said earlier, the logger is a master. The PLC is a slave. And you can set the logger to trigger continuously. In other words, pull the data. Ask for the data as fast as you can ask. Or I can say event-driven. I can then say, look at C2. I'm giving an example here. And what the logger will do is continuously look at C2. And whenever it's on, it will log the items you put here on the next tab. You're going to see this in a minute. On tab 3 here, you're going to put the items you want to log to the logger, the items you want to pull out of the PLC and put into your spreadsheet. You're setting up the trigger for how often you want to grab those items from the PLC. So what I'm saying here right now is whenever C2 goes on, I want you to log continuously. If C2 were to go off, the logger would stop logging the items on tab 3. I have another bunch of options here though. Log when on, continuous. Log continuous when off. In other words, if C2 is off, log continuous. Log once when C2 goes high. Log once when C2 goes low. Or log once when it goes high or when it goes low. So on both edges, when it turns on, it'll log once. When it turns off, it'll log once. The other option you have is what's called interval. By the way, let me back up here one step. I showed you a C. You can also trigger off an X. You can also trigger off a Y. You can also trigger off a timer. You can also trigger off a counter. Now, one thing you want to be aware of, and I'll show this to you in another video, is that you want to make sure C2 is on. If you're going to say, for example, log once when it goes high. If C2 only goes high for one scan inside the PLC, it is possible that the logger will not be asking for it at that moment and it won't see it. So you want to make sure that the C is on for, say, 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, so you guarantee that the logger sees it. Because remember, the logger has to say, is C2 on? And the PLC responds, yes or no. Then it says, is C2 on? And the PLC responds, yes or no. So you want to make sure that whatever bits you pick here, whether it be an X or a Y or a C or a T or a CT, that it's on for a short period of time, not just one scan. Otherwise, it is possible it will miss it. Next, we have something here called interval. Interval says, for example here, hours, minutes, and seconds. Right now it's set for 1 second. If I put 10 in here, now it will log whatever items you put on tab 3 once every 10 seconds. The next thing you've got here, samples per trigger. every time this thing triggers a log, whether it be once every 10 seconds or based on an event, how many samples do you want to pull out of the PLC? And you can go from 1 to 100. So if I say 25 here, whenever every 10 seconds, I'm going to grab 25 samples of the items here on the items to log tab. Down the row here, we say, when do you want to create a new file on the logger? Based on an event. So I can say yes, based on event, and we can say based on X3 turning on. And now every time X3 turns on, you will create a new file on the logger. And we just index the number from 0001 to 0002 to 003 and so on. The other thing you have an option of here is that say, look, in my log file, in my CSV file, I want, for example, 25,000 rows. And every time it reaches 25,000 rows, the logger will automatically create a new file with the next number on it. Remember, whether the new file is triggered off of an event or the new file is triggered off of you reaching 25,000 rows in this case, it will create a new file with the next number indexed on it. Last thing on this page is you have two options for your date and timestamp on your file. In your CSV file, when we pull the items out of the PLC that you want to log and put them into the CSV file, you have a date and timestamp on them. You can grab the logger date and timestamp, which you set right here. You can click on Set the Logger, and you can say the present time is this, set the time, and logger's been set. Or you could also pull this down and say user defined. And you can say look at specific memory locations. You can tell us what DS locations in the PLC you want us to use for the seconds, the minutes, the hours, the days, the month, the year. In this case, I'm going to say logger. So we're not going to use user defined for this example, but you could do that if you wanted to. Last thing you got to do, if you watch, you say, I want to go get Y1, and I'm going to call this door switch. Now what this is going to do, folks, is every 10 seconds, we're going to get 25 samples of what the position of Y001 is, and at the column, at the top of the column, the header in your CSV file is going to be door switch, and right underneath it, it's going to say Y001. And you can log multiple items. I can say get me T5 and call that dwell time. Now, when I get this all filled out, I click on Configure Logger. It says, your settings have been changed, click OK to save them. Your settings have changed, click OK to save them. It pops up and says, what do you want to name this on your hard drive? The default is, to my documents, I'm going to say this is going to be for the demo 1 for the logger. It saves it to the hard drive. It also moves all the data. If you saw that window pop up there quickly, it moved all the data in the data folder to the old data folder from previous tests and previous runs. And it put a new file, if I go out here, put a new file in the data folder called config. And that's what the logger is going to run on, is that new configuration, which was created with this tool. Now in the future, if I want to, I can open up the tool and I can say load settings. If I click on load settings, I can go out to my folder and I can find my XML files. The tool will automatically save this configuration in an XML file called demo1.xml automatically. It also puts a copy of it in the folder out here called configs. And there's a config right here called demo1. So if you forget where you put it on your hard drive, or if your hard drive crashes, or if you're out in the field and you don't have the original XML file on your hard drive, we did put a copy of it in here in the folder called configs, just so you have kind of a backup on the logger. We suggest you make sure you have a copy on your hard drive, but just for backup purposes and ease of use purposes, because you might not have it when you're out in the field. You might end up in a cotton field somewhere with an oil well and you don't have your hard drive, you don't have your laptop. You could always go to the tool and go to load settings and load them off of that config file. And that's it. Now, one last thing. When I go to close the tool out, most people don't know this and they don't follow these rules. It's a Microsoft rule. Whenever you write to an SD card, you're supposed to eject it. you're supposed to go down in your taskbar and eject the thumb drive before you yank it out. Most people just yank it out. And 9 times out of 10, you don't have a problem. But I want you to avoid a problem. So when I go to close this in a minute, we automatically eject the logger. The logger shows up to a Windows-based computer as a mass storage device, and it must be ejected, especially after you write to it, because Windows will close out the files and take care of some overhead and make sure that the SD card is shut down properly and there's nothing hanging open. And we do it for you automatically. So when I go to close it, it says, hey, after you click OK, make sure you get the configuration message below that says USB disk ejector in your taskbar. Okay? Otherwise, if it doesn't do it, because in some versions of Windows, depending on your security settings, it may not work right. You might want to go to these instructions and go and eject it yourself. It's actually pretty simple. You go to your taskbar and you right-click on the device, and you just say eject, and Windows shuts it down. But I'm going to go ahead and click OK. It says attempting to automatically eject the logger. It's going through what it has to do to shut down the files and eject it. And that's it. It's done. It says here that a little popped up and says that the USB ejector was successful. And that's it, folks. That's